On September 28, 1958, an AIM-9B Sidewinder, fired by a Taiwanese F-86, struck a Chinese MiG-17 during an air battle over the Taiwan Strait and failed to explode. The pilot flew the damaged jet home rather than bail out, missile and all, and ground crews later recovered it fully intact. Within days, Moscow was pressing Beijing to hand it over. The Soviet Union treated it as one of the most valuable weapons intelligence hauls of the Cold War, reverse engineering it into its own K-13 missile within about 2 years. Within 8 years, American pilots flying the missile's original version over Vietnam were hitting their targets only about 18% of the time they fired it. No equivalent rate survives for the K-13, but it was already turning at least one of the North Vietnamese pilots flying it into an ace. One Sidewinder. One failed detonation. 2 air forces that ended up owing an entire generation of weapons to the exact same instant that one American missile should have gone off and didn't. The missile itself began nowhere near a defense contractor's boardroom. William B. McLean earned 3 degrees in physics at Caltech, finishing with a doctorate in 1939, then spent the Second World War designing proximity fuses for the National Bureau of Standards before moving to the Naval Ordnance Test Station in California's high desert after the war. In 1946, McLean started what he called Local Fuse Project 602 at the China Lake Test Range in California's high desert, an unauthorized side project built on borrowed lab time, volunteer labor, and spare parts, aimed at a single idea: a small heat-seeking rocket that could steer itself into a jet engine's exhaust without a pilot ever needing to aim it precisely. McLean's own design philosophy was blunt, simple, reliable, and inexpensive, embodied literally in the missile's stabilizing fins, small air-driven flywheels called rollerons that kept the missile from spinning using nothing but the airstream itself, no separate gyroscope required. That philosophy showed up directly in the price tag. By the late 1960s, a single AIM-9B cost somewhere in the neighborhood of $20,000 against roughly $500,000 for a single AIM-7 Sparrow, an order of magnitude gap that let the Navy and, eventually, the Air Force put Sidewinders on nearly every fighter in the inventory, rather than rationing them the way a far more expensive radar-guided missile had to be rationed. The project stayed informal enough that it was not officially sanctioned to build weapons at all until 1950, when McLean named it Sidewinder after the desert rattlesnake that hunts warm-blooded prey in total darkness using paired heat-sensing pit organs on its face, a biological parallel close enough to the missile's own passive infrared seeker that the name stuck instantly and never needed explaining to anyone who used it, and 1951, when it was mature enough to demonstrate to Admiral William Deke Parsons, the Navy's Deputy Chief of Ordnance, who finally authorized real funding. Even that authorization did not make the missile a sure thing. The first live firing came on September 3, 1952, and the earliest test shots missed their targets entirely, 12 consecutive failures before the missile finally intercepted a drone for the first time on September 11, 1953. It also had a rival to beat before anyone would trust it in real service. The United States Air Force had already committed to its own radar-guided Falcon missile from Hughes Aircraft, and inter-service rivalry alone kept the Air Force from touching the Navy's heat-seeking design until a formal fly-off in June 1955 demonstrated the Sidewinder's clear superiority and forced the issue. It entered service in 1956, and its first combat use came 2 years later, in the middle of a real crisis rather than a training exercise. The Second Taiwan Strait Crisis, in which the People's Republic of China had opened an artillery bombardment of the Quemoy and Matsu Islands on August 23, 1958, that fired more than 40,000 shells on its first day alone and roughly 500,000 by October, a confrontation serious enough that U.S. Secretary of State Christian Herter later called it the first genuinely nuclear-tinged crisis of the Cold War, and one that eventually settled into an arrangement almost too strange to be real. Rather than a genuine ceasefire, Beijing and Taipei quietly agreed to shell Kinmen on alternating days, China firing on odd days, and Taiwan's own guns answering on even ones, both sides timing their own bunker runs around a fixed schedule that lasted in that exact form for 21 more years until 1979. On September 22, 1958, Taiwan's Air Force, quietly fitted with the missile by a covert United States Marine Corps integration team, flew the Sidewinder into combat for the first time in history, and by September 24th had scored the missile's first confirmed kills. By the time the crisis wound down, Taiwan's F-86s had downed 31 PLA MiGs for the loss of just 2 of their own aircraft, a lopsided result Western press at the time attributed heavily to the new missile. McLean himself was recognized for it directly. President Eisenhower personally presented him a $25,000 award and a plaque for the Sidewinder, and he went on to serve as China Lake's technical director from 1954 until 1967. One MiG-17 among those engagements, hit but not destroyed, is where this story actually turns. What made the Sidewinder work, and what made its failure that day so consequential, sits in the same piece of engineering. The missile's nose held a lead sulfide infrared detector, a passive sensor that needed no radar, no radio guidance, and no help from the launching aircraft at all once fired. Just heat. That simplicity was also its narrowest limitation. The detector could reliably lock onto little besides a jet engine's hot exhaust, which meant the missile worked only from behind a target, chasing its tailpipe, with almost no ability to track anything approaching from the side or head-on. That detector worked by constantly sensing exactly how far off-center a target's heat source set relative to the missile's own line of flight, then steering itself back toward center dozens of times a second, entirely on its own, without a single radio signal or radar pulse ever passing between missile and aircraft. The warhead behind that guidance system was a modest one, by later standards, about 4.5 kilograms of blast fragmentation explosive fused to detonate on a passive infrared proximity sensor rather than on direct contact, built to go off within roughly 9 meters of a target and shred it with fragments rather than needing a literal hit. Exactly why that proximity fuse failed to trigger against the 11th MiG-17 has never been fully settled in the public record, the most consistent explanation pointing to a fuse or electronics fault rather than a clean design flaw, but no definitive account has ever closed the question. Consider that for a moment. The single most consequential dud in Cold War missile history might have been an entirely ordinary mechanical failure, the same kind any of the roughly 80,000 AIM-9B missiles built between 1958 and 1962 could theoretically have suffered, and it happened to be the one that survived intact long enough to be studied in detail by the people it was built to kill. That narrow rear attack limitation, not the dud itself, is the actual problem Soviet engineers inherited along with their new prize, and it is also, 8 years later and thousands of kilometers away, the exact detail behind the 18%. What made the design worth stealing in the first place, limitation and all, was what it did not need once it left the rail. Unlike the radar-guided AIM-7 Sparrow, the United States Air Force had bet on instead, which required the launching pilot to keep his own radar locked onto the target, straight and level, until the missile actually hit. The Sidewinder was fire and forget, homing entirely on its own heat once released, freeing the pilot to break away and maneuver immediately after the shot. That single difference is why an Air Force with a much smaller, cheaper missile program kept beating a rival built around a far more expensive one. And it is exactly the mechanism Soviet engineers were trying to reproduce, not just its failure to go off once. The one time the US Navy itself tried to depart from that heat-seeking formula made the same point by failing. Between 1965 and 1967, Motorola built about 1,000 examples of the AIM-9C, a semi-active radar homing variant fitted exclusively to the F-8 Crusader, and it proved so unreliable at tracking a maneuvering target that most of the surviving stock was later converted into an entirely different weapon, the AGM-122 sidearm anti-radiation missile, rather than kept flying as an air-to-air weapon at all. How that narrow rear attack requirement actually played out in combat is where the missile's reputation and its real record split apart. Over Vietnam, American pilots fired 452 AIM-9B, D, and E model Sidewinders and scored roughly 82 confirmed kills, a hit rate of about 18%, badly undercut by exactly the limitation built into the missile's original 1949 design. It needed a clean tail chase, it lost lock easily against ground clutter and sun glare, and it could be defeated by a target simply turning hard enough to break the missile's limited tracking rate, or by a decoy flare bright enough to pull its seeker off the real engine heat entirely. The Soviet Union's own copy was flying in the same war on the opposite side of the fight, and while no comparable aggregate hit rate statistic survives for it the way it does for the American original, its own doctrine was built specifically around the one shot the missile was actually capable of, rather than one that kept running into its limitations. North Vietnamese ground controllers, guided by their own early warning radar over home territory, built an entire doctrine around exactly the shot their missile actually needed. Position a MiG-21 directly behind an American formation, close fast, fire once, and disengage immediately rather than staying to fight. A one-pass-then-leave tactic that never asked the K-13 to do anything but the single rear attack shot it was capable of in the first place. North Vietnamese MiG-21 pilots carried the K-13 as their primary air-to-air weapon for most of the war, and one of them, Nguyen Van Kock, flying a MiG-21 PF with the 921st Fighter Regiment, credited every one of his 9 confirmed aerial victories, 7 manned aircraft, and 2 reconnaissance drones between 1966 and 1969 to that missile alone, becoming an ace on November 18, 1967, with a kill against an American F-105, and later serving as an instructor to the next generation of North Vietnamese pilots. Real, individually credited victories on the same rear attack-only seeker, the same basic airframe, flying inside a doctrine built to suit it rather than against a doctrine that kept exposing it. The Sidewinder's American operators were not the only ones learning this the hard way in the skies over Vietnam, either. The AIM-7 Sparrow, the far more expensive radar-guided missile the U.S. Air Force had originally favored over the Sidewinder, scored well under 10% in the same war, a wider reckoning across an entire generation of first-generation guided missiles built with more confidence than any of them had actually earned yet, not a failure unique to the design the Soviets happened to have stolen. That reckoning reached all the way into fighter design itself. The U.S. Navy and Air Force had built the F-4 Phantom II around the belief that missiles like the Sidewinder and Sparrow had made the gun obsolete in air combat, and left its earliest models without one at all, a doctrine Vietnam's actual dogfights, close-in, visual, and fought against pilots who knew exactly how to force a missile-armed jet inside its own missile's narrow performance envelope, exposed as wrong badly enough that the Navy stood up its fighter weapons school, later known as TOPGUN, and the Air Force eventually built the F-4E with an internal 20mm cannon bolted back onto a design that was never supposed to need one. The Soviet Union did not keep the K-13 to itself either. Starting in the early 1960s, it went out to Warsaw Pact air forces, to Egypt and Syria, to North Korea, and to client states in Africa, including Angola and Ethiopia, arming MiG-21 and MiG-19 fleets across 3 continents, with Romania eventually building its own licensed version, the A-91, rather than importing every unit. The United States eventually solved its own version of the problem, the way engineering usually solves an inherited flaw, not by scrapping the design, but by rebuilding the specific part that had actually failed. The AIM-9D and AIM-9G widened the seeker's field of view and improved its cooling. The AIM-9L, fielded in 1976, became the first all-aspect Sidewinder capable of a shot from any angle, including head-on, not just from directly behind. In the 1982 Falklands War, British Sea Harriers flying the AIM-9L scored roughly 80%, and that same year, over Lebanon's Bekaa Valley, Israeli pilots hit Syrian MiGs with it at roughly 85%. Numbers that turned the same missile family's own earlier 18% into a problem that belonged to an entirely different generation of the same weapon. The copy did not carry a uniformly better record than the original either, which complicates any simple the theft paid off reading of this story. Israel captured intact R-3S missiles from Egyptian stocks during the Six-Day War in June 1967, and reverse-engineered a version of its own onto Mirage 3CJ fighters, using them alongside its indigenous Shafrir missile through the following years of low-level conflict. By the October 1973 Yom Kippur War, Egyptian MiG-21 aircraft were firing R-3S missiles defensively over the Sinai in real numbers, and at least one military aviation historian, Tom Cooper, has pointed to the missile's own substandard performance as a real contributor to the Arab Air Force's losses that war, the same basic seeker that had made Nguyen Van Kock an ace in Vietnam, apparently far less dependable half a world away and 6 years later. The angle almost nobody sits with is how completely the theft worked out for everyone except the country whose secret got taken, and how far the copying actually went beyond just Moscow. China had handed the recovered missile over in 1958, expecting nothing more than Soviet gratitude. But in 1961, the Soviet Union shared its own K-13 technical data and hardware back with Beijing, and Chinese engineers began replicating that missile in turn, starting live fire tests of their own version, the PL-2, in 1967, and finally reaching full series production in 1970 after the Cultural Revolution delayed the program for years. China ended up building a domestic copy of the Soviet copy of its own recovered American missile, a 3-country chain of reverse engineering that started with a single MiG-17 pilot's decision not to bail out over open water, and even the PL-2 kept extending outward afterward, spawning its own family of further Chinese derivatives, most of which went nowhere except one, the PL-5, which did. The Soviet Union's reverse-engineered K-13 did not stay a one-off copy either. It became the direct ancestor of an entire family of Soviet and Russian infrared missiles, the R-60 that followed it in the late 1960s and the R-73 after that. Weapons still in frontline Russian service today, tracing their lineage in an unbroken line back to one American missile that happened to survive a Chinese MiG-17's fuselage intact. The original American line did the same thing in parallel, and for years barely seemed to notice it was in a race at all. West Germany's Bodenseewerk Gerätetechnik alone built thousands of NATO standard Sidewinders under license. The later all-aspect AIM-9L was built in the tens of thousands across Raytheon, Ford, Bodenseewerk, and Mitsubishi production lines combined. Sidewinder production eventually passed 200,000 units across every variant and every country that built it under license. And by Raytheon's own count, more than 30 countries fly the current AIM-9X today. Two entirely separate weapons industries, one in China Lake and one in Moscow, spent the following 6 decades building on the lessons of the exact same failed detonation, each one certain it was refining its own original idea, neither one ever quite able to point to a moment when the other side's missile stopped looking like a mirror image of its own. Read that lineage twice, and it still holds. Nearly 70 years after a single Sidewinder failed to explode inside a MiG-17 over the Taiwan Strait, the fighters of 2 air forces that were never supposed to share a design still carry its direct descendants under their wings. American and NATO jets fly the AIM-9X, the missile's 5th generation, entering service in 2003 with an imaging infrared seeker that builds an actual picture of its target rather than just sensing raw heat, a thrust vectoring exhaust in place of the original's simple tail fins, and the ability to be aimed by a pilot's helmet rather than the nose of the aircraft, still in active production more than 70 years after McLean's first spare parts prototype. Russian jets fly the R-73 and its own later refinements, a lineage that starts, however uncomfortably for the country that built the original, with a dud that never went off. Think about how small the object actually was that set all of this in motion. 10 pounds of warhead, a self-steering heat sensor, a set of fins that steadied themselves on nothing but the wind, riding inside the airframe of an enemy fighter that was never supposed to land safely enough to bring it home.